Okay, welcome everyone to the SCA program for Tish'a BeAb. This year on Zoom, there are a number of classes going on today. Make sure that you log on to scatorah.org to access all of the classes that are available. In today's class that we're going to speak about this morning regarding Megillat Ekha is the question of how. Right? The word Ekha, Megillat Ekha starts with that word Ekha, how? Ekha yasheva badad ha'ir rabati am hayeta ke'almana rabati bagoyim sarati bamedinot hayeta lamas. Right? How is it possible that this city of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem, that once was the greatest among nations, full of people, became Lamas, a city that's sitting alone, Badad. And there's a lot of perakim, right? There's a few perakim here within Megillat Ekha. There are 5 perakim. And as you've noticed, as you were hopefully, going through Ekha last night, this morning, you would have noticed the Aleph Bet throughout Ekha, the acrostic, right? Every pasuk, 22 pasukim in the first, second, and fourth perek going through the Aleph Bet. The third perek has 3 of every letter, and the last perek has 22 pasukim, but we'll speak about that in a moment, about what's going on there. But the question is, we don't have a few hours right now to study Ekha. I wanted to focus on this question of how, right? This question of Ekha, how can it be that Yerushalayim became so desolate? What exactly happened? And how did it happen? Through the words of Yirmiyah Hanavi. And as we see and we look carefully at the Pesukim in Ekha, we notice something very purposeful within the first perek, and that is a repeated phrase, right? Every time we see a repeated phrase within Tanakh, especially within the same perek, we know that that phrase is being pointed out purposely. And already from the beginning, Yirmiyah says, En lah menahem mikol ohabeha, that Yerushalayim has no comforters, no one to comfort her from her struggles. All of her friends committed treason against her. They became her enemies. And the next pasuk plays off of that. Hi yasheva bagoyim lo mase'a manoah. That Yerushalayim, or Yehuda, goes into Galut and does not find any place to settle, no resting place. And Yirmiyah continues, and you see all of the black underlines over here, purposeful. Again, Vateret Pelaim en menahem la, there's no one to comfort her. Re'eh Adonai et oni, God, see my suffering. And again, I'm crying. My eyes are tearing. Kirahak mimeni menahem, because the one that can comfort me is very far away. And yet again, Peresat Sion be'adea en menahem la, no comfort. And the final one of this perek, Shame'u kin enahani, but there's no one to comfort me, en menahem li. And you have to ask yourself the question, why does the Nabi repeatedly use this phrase, En menahem, kirahak mimeni menahem, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, En menahem, 1 time, lo mase'a manoah. What is the Nabi doing here? Number 1, if you think of the idea of an Avel, this is the day of Avelut. This is the day that I mean, really, truthfully, I should be sitting on the floor right now teaching this class with my computer on my lap. It's a day of Avelut, right? We know the minhag that at Hasot at 102, we point out Hasot because while people are teaching, we get up from our seats. But what's this En Menachem? It's about Avelut. The Avelut is so deep into Am Yisrael. There's so much suffering going on. It's repeated over and over and over again because the Navi is hurt. Yerushalayim is hurt. Yehuda is hurt. There are so many different players, quote unquote, within this destruction that within all of it, the Navi is feeling this lack of nehama, of comfort. Let's look at each one carefully. It starts with, En lah menachem mikol ohaveha. Who do you expect to come comfort you? When Chas v'shalom, someone passes away, the people who are friendly with you, your re'im, they come to comfort you. When it speaks about Sefer Iyov, right, one of the other books you're allowed to study on Tish'a BeAb, it talks about the re'im of Iyov. Friends come to visit him. Here, Yerushalayim is crying because it has no one to come comfort. At least an Avel has someone to say, you should have comfort. Here, there's none. Right? And that continues into the first Perek of Ekha, setting up this. There's no Menachem, so what does Yirmiyah say? What does Yirmiyah pray for? En Menachem la, I'll bring it up in the Hebrew English. Over here, we're in Pasuk Tet, which is the Pasuk of Tum'ah. Pasuk Tet. There's Tum'ah, so no Menachem. So Yirmiyah says, Re'e Adonai et onyi ki hichdil oyev. There's no comfort. So God, see my suffering. Please see what's going on over here. I need some comfort. God, come comfort me. And what happens in the next pasuk we get to? There's no comfort yet. Ki rahak mimeni menachem. It's so far away, deep into this point. Why? Because the God that's wanted for Nehama is not there. If anything, God is the one who instructed this to happen. And I mentioned that last night in the class, that we say, Sadiq hu Adonai. There's no Menachem, there's no comfort. Siva Adonai liYaakov sebivav sarab. It's God who's orchestrating this. And I'll add something that I spoke about last night as well. If you look at this first Perek and you look at the Aleph Bet order, when you think of Aleph Bet, you think of order. And when you think of order, you should think of positive things. And here it's the opposite. God has orchestrated an Aleph Bet, an acrostic, something that's orchestrated against Am Yisrael. And with that, there's no Menachem. With that, we mentioned Sadiq hu Adonai kifihu mariti. Right? The letter that you expect for Sadi, the word you expect for Sadi to fall on that letter of this acrostic of this Perek is Sadiq. It's not us who are the Sadiqim. It's God who is the Sadiq. It's God who's doing what's righteous, that we are failing. Right? And then to continue on to Pasuk Peh. Pasuk Peh says, we just read Pasuk Peh, sorry. Pasuk Shin. Shame'u ki ne'enaha'ani. What's the word to say to comfort? Menachem. But here it's a play on that. Shame'u ki ne'enaha'ani. Right? Vaye'anehu. What's le'enah? we're talking about sighing. You're sighing out of grief. But there's en menachem. That's why I'm ne'enaha'ani, because there is no menachem. Now we can't but think over here about the other story in Chumash that we're reminded of when we read this, especially this one that we skipped for the moment that says, Lo mase'a manoach, right? Lo mase'a manoach. What does this remind us of? I see a couple of you realizing this reminds us of the story of Noah, the story of Noah. Yirmiyah does this purposely, reminds us of the destruction within Sefer Bereshit that reminds us of what? It reminds us of Hamas. It reminds us of the evil that people were doing. Let's take a look at that right now. It starts the story of Noah before Perashat Noah. Vayar Adonai ki rabba ra'at ha'adam ba'aretz. The people evil. V'chol yesed machshebot libo rak ra' kol hayom. I know none of us want to think of this, and none of us want to believe even something like this. But this was the reality, both at the time of the Mabul, and Yirmiyah, by using this phrase, is saying also at the time of his time, of the destruction of the Mikdash. V'chol yesed machshebot libo rak ra' kol hayom. Vayinachem Adonai. Here's that word. Vayinachem. God regretted ki asay ha'adam ba'aretz. It's not the same word as the word, right? Menachem, because menachem means to comfort, but it's surely related. Vayinachem, which means to regret, and nehama, which means, right, comfort. And we see within the Tanakh both being used, right? Vayinachem Adonai, God regretted making man. God said, Emhe et ha'adam, I'm going to wipe out mankind. Ki nihamti ki asitim, because I regret making people, humankind. Who was the antidote to that? Noah. Noah, and you think of that word nehama, to comfort, and then God's being niham, regretting making man. Noah was the one who was able to save the world, to be through him. But look, what happens even within the Mabul? That pasuk we just mentioned, that when Noah sends the Yonah out, look at this pasuk. Vayshalach et hayonah, when he sends the Yonah out the first time, it says, Velo mase'a hayonah manoach bechaf ragla. The Yonah, which represents probably freedom and represents Am Yisrael, a bird being free. The Yonah has to return back to the Teva because there's water flooding everywhere. Velo mase'a manoach. That is what we just mentioned over here in this pasuk. Let me bring up the pasuk again so you see it. Galeta Yehuda me'oni, that we've gone into exile. We're sitting by the goyim. Lo mase'a manoach. This yeshiva in the goyim, yasheva, we speak out sitting down, right? That's what an avel does. An avel sits on the floor. Am Yisrael is sitting by the goyim because there's none to comfort her. And there's nowhere to rest. So you could see how they're playing off of each other. There's no one to comfort her, and there's nowhere to rest and to get comfort. Kol rodefea hisirua ben hamesarim. And we speak about this idea of ben hamesarim when we speak about the 3-week period. The Achamim talk about this ben hamesarim. We're being, in the narrow places, we're being pushed by the enemy for destruction. So we see over here already in the first perek, Yirmiyah sets the tone of one, the idea of avelut, of the idea of mourning, that there's no one to comfort. God can't comfort. There's nowhere to rest, just like with the Yonah in the story of the Mabul. Why? Because in the Mabul, maybe there's one Sadiq, right? You see that word Sadiq. Noah was an Ish Sadiq. In this story, the Navi, Yirmiyah, who might be the Sadiq, tells God, no, you're the Sadiq. Why? Let's take a look further over here. Because it gets so bad. The next Perek also has a similar common word. Bila. Bila Adonai velo hamal. God swallowed up Am Yisrael. And you think of swallowing, swallowed up. Am Yisrael. And again, that word Ekha, Perek Bet, starts with that word Ekha again. Ech. Bila Adonai velo hamal. God had no compassion. Maybe Yirmiyah is saying, maybe look, have some compassion. Don't you remember what you promised at the time of the Mabul? To not destroy so much? And to have some compassion, to see the Kesh. And you know what happens instead? What happens instead? And this is so terrible. This is so awful that Am Yisrael is behaving in such a way. Look at the pasuk. Darach kashto ke'oyev. When you think of the Mabul and you think of the Keshet and you think of our redemption, quote unquote, of something positive to look at, look at the way the word Keshet is used in Sefer Ekha. Darach kashto ke'oyev. God used his Keshet against us like an enemy. And he bent his bow to hurt us and to destroy us. That's the total opposite of what we want. Even when there's evil going on, we don't want total destruction. And the Navi feels total destruction. Tarach kashto ke'oyev. Bila, us being swallowed up. Bila Yisrael, bila kol armenoteha. Our buildings, our castles, the Mikdash is swallowed up. Lo heshiv yado mi baleya. God did not hold back. Why didn't God hold back? Because we did not hold back. Because we did not hold back our tongues like arrows. We did not hold back our hands to destroy and hurt others. And so, if you want to look for a moment at this word Ekha, Ech. So we read, besides for reading Ekha on Tish'a BeAb, we also read Ha'azinu. And in Ha'azinu we say, Ekha, how could this be? How is this possible? That this ever happened, that this type of situation ever occurred. How can it be that one of our enemy pursued 1,000 and 2,000? If not for God selling us to our enemies. Why? Because we forgot God. We turned to other gods. Now, I must mention this because in today's day and age, we think of when we read about, oh, their sin was Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah and what comes along with it. An idea of being invincible. An idea of, I can overcome all this even if I'm bad and it's okay. No. Avodah Zarah is about being self-centered and saying, I can murder and no one will catch me. I can steal and no one will catch me. I can hurt my fellow, backstab them, and no one will catch me. And with that, I want to, for the last few minutes of class, speak about Yirmiyah himself in the Pesukim that lead up to the Haftarah that we read today. The Haftarah that we read today, this morning, whether you were able to make it to Bet Knesset or on Zoom in the Haftarah that we read today. Usually on a weekday, we don't read a Haftarah. In today's Haftarah, which started actually right after these Pesukim we're going to look at for a moment over here. It's very difficult. Yirmiyah is in a very difficult time. I'm actually going to bring this up. Let me try to bring this up in Sefaria and Hebrew English. Give me a moment. There we go. Yirmiyah Perek Het. Pesukim He till Tet. So he says, Madua shoeva ha'am hazeh Yerushalayim. Let's go back one pasuk. Ve'amarta alehem, Ko amar Adonai, hayipelu velo yakumu, im yashuv velo yashuv. When men fall, do they not get up again? If they turn aside, do they not turn back? Meaning, most people, when they fall or they go away from something, they should return. Am Yisrael should return to me, but they're not. Madua shobeba ha'am hazeh Yerushalayim mishuban yisahat. Why are they so rebellious? They're refusing to listen to the words of the Navi. How many times we refuse to listen to ourselves even to say to do teshuvah, to our own minds, and then to the Navi and the leaders. God says, I've listened to what they're saying, and you know what they're doing? En ish niham al ra'ato. There's no person that's niham, regretting their evil. Remember we spoke about God regretting making us. He regrets giving us Israel and Yerushalayim because we're not regretting our evil. Lemor me asiti. Kulo shav bimrusatam kesus shotef b'milchama. We all persist, God says, like a steed dashing forward in the fray. We're just going off course. Gam hasida b'shamayim. Even the stork knows her seasons. Talking about even animals know. Ve'amil yadeu et mishpat Adonai. And here's the clincher. Ekha tomeru. Remember Ekha? Ekha. Well, how is it that we're destroyed? Yirmiyah already tells us how. Ekha tomeru hachamim anachnu. Well, how can you say that you're wise and smart? V'torat Adonai itanu achen hine la sheker asa et sheker soferim. You want to know why? You want to know Ekha yasheva badad? Ekha hayta lezona? How? Because you're saying the Torah is with us, and says the Midrash, the letters Ekha, the idea of Ekha being in an acrostic is that we've disobeyed the Torah, which was written with all the letters, Aleph through Tav. We've disobeyed the Torah. Right? The Midrash adds the Aleph of the Yehud of Hashem, the Yod of the Ten Commandments, the Kaf of the 20 generations till Abraham got Berit Milah, so Berit Milah, and had the 5 books of the Torah. We're saying that we're smart, but it's all falsehood. Hovishu hachamim hatu vayilachedu hine bidvar Adonai ma'asu ve'chochmat melahem. There's no chokhmah when you go against the word of the Torah. And so Yirmiyah tells us that this Ekha is answered by the Ekha of us. When we really ask how, we know how. We know by the lack of wisdom, of using our wisdom to turn to God and hopefully have that nehama. But no, we don't want a manoah. We don't want the nehama. And therefore we will not the nehama as long as we don't want it, as long as we're not focused on that goal. They asked us now to stop, to give time to go to the other classes. There's other teachers coming on at this time. I believe, there's a class happening right now in a few minutes. So they asked our classes to be 25 minutes. So again, take that to heart about the Mehama and looking for our comfort from God by doing our proper teshuvah. Thank you.